Here we are with yet again another Rant Files, this time about a video game again. As you can see, it's another PlayStation 3 release. I never played these games on the PlayStation 2, and if you want somewhat of a review type video, you might want to go elsewhere, because as far as I'm concerned, a lot of people with a lot better skills than me at editing have already made videos talking about Sly 1, 2, and 3. So, really, there's nothing new you can really offer to this series in regards to reviewing them. All you can really do is offer your own personal experience with them, which is usually what I like to think about when I make these types of videos. I think maybe I should offer my 2 cents about this video. Maybe I should discuss how I felt about these videos, about these video games. So, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go over all 3, and I'm going to rate my personal experience and which ones I view as the best and which one made this Rant file needed, so to speak. As I said in a previous video, or maybe in the previous video comment section, I don't know, the Rant files will be the ones where I'm going to practice making videos without scripting them, so that I can teach myself or force myself to learn how to organize my thoughts without writing everything down and just reading off of them. I'm trying to train myself into speaking on the spot, rather than reading from a paper. But for the lore files, I'm going to script those, because they're supposed to be of a little bit higher quality since they're pertaining to what I've written as an author and things of that nature. So those will be scripted. These will not be scripted for the time being. So, for the first one we will talk about is Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus. I'm not going to offer any gameplay video footage because, honestly, if you've played these games, you've seen the gameplay footage firsthand. If you've watched a Sly Cooper review, you've seen the video game footage firsthand. That's not why you're here. And if it is, I'm sorry to disappoint you. For the first Sly Cooper game, I was fairly content that nothing really stood out to me as rant-worthy. The only thing I suppose I didn't like was that Sly was a one-hit KO type of character unless you collected enough coins to give yourself a horseshoe clover or something like that to give you an extra hit. Sometimes you'll see them in the world. That, I suppose, is not really something to rant about, but more of a nitpick. It's something that they pulled over from the PlayStation 1 era, where you'd have things like Spyro and Crash. They'd have their one-hit and KO unless they had Sparks or that Tiki guy that I can never remember his name off the top of my head. So that's technically what I think that this first installation was stemming from. It was stemming from that type of platformer experience. And that's fine to me. This setup, the hub world, and the X amounts of levels that you can go to was also pulled from platformers like Spyro and Crash, and none of that really bothered me so much as maybe the mini-game segments. They became more numerous with each hub world you went into. Like, there was one where you had to have Murray drive around and do a race, and the van was basically skating on ice. It was skating on ice, and you had to become first place. You had to win first place, or you failed, and you had to keep doing it again. And there was another one where you had to bonk the chickens within the time limit. There was another one where you had to bonk the crabs and get the treasure boxes within the time limit or whatever. And there was another one where you had to run over some fish and light tikis. There was another one that was basically a Murray shooting gallery. And to a lot of people, they thought, oh, that just varies the gameplay up, that's fine. And I can agree with that to an extent. But I think it should be more like how Spyro did it. In Spyro 2 and 3 especially, they had those types of gameplay variations, but very few of them were required, so to speak. Like, they were optional levels that you could go into. You finished the main level as Spyro in the main normal gameplay, and then you saw these little side areas that you could go to, and you can gain extra orbs or extra dragon eggs and things of that nature. But it was all optional. It was required if you wanted 100% the game, of course, but in regards to just beating the final boss, you didn't have to do that stuff. And that's what I felt that Sly 1 should have taken a note from. I think that they should have made these mini-game segment levels optional. Like, they would count towards 100% of your file, but you shouldn't need to do those to progress into the next boss fight, into the next world, etc. You shouldn't need to do all of them like that. At least that's my personal take on that, but that's one of my gripes to that game, and that's what lost it a few points in my personal experience with it. The final boss was also something I wanted to nitpick with, because most of it was just a series of mini-games without actually using Sly in the gameplay style that he was originally meant to use. Like, you were using throughout most of the game. You were doing the platforming, you were doing the acrobating, you were doing the stealth stuff, you were doing all of that stuff, and you learned that gameplay, you learned that stuff. But then you had a shooting gallery on the van, and then you had some sort of Bentley hacker mission, and then you had some other mission where you're trying to grab these computers and run them over before the other guys hit the computers. Then there was this thing where you're flying in the air and you're trying to hit hit Clockwork, and then there's another second segment where you're flying in the air trying to hit Clockwork. Oh, and I also forgot to mention there's another shooting gallery with Carmelita, which is basically yet another thing you did beforehand where you were trying to protect Murray. This time you're protecting Sly. And it was just a series of gameplay elements that was not the main gameplay element that was Sly. And I felt that that kind of harmed the game in some way to me. I think for a final boss, you should take everything you've learned and everything you've gained using your character and apply that to a final boss. You don't just make it a minigame segment where you're just doing something that's shown that one time that you've never done before, such as the jetpack thing. You shouldn't do that. After the 2 jetpack segments, you go back to playing Sly as normal, and you're doing this little acrobating, platforming segment where you're trying to get to Clockwork before the lava hits you and all that stuff. That's fine. That's fine. That's what it should have been like. It shouldn't have been the jetpack segment in the front, though, because that's a brand new gameplay segment. It does divvy up the game a lot, but it shouldn't be your main focus for a final boss like that. At least in my opinion. It's overall a very serviceable game. It's overall a game that I was able to platinum without too much trouble. So there's nothing I have wrong to say about that. This isn't the game that I ended up making this rant files for. So let's move on into the second one, Sly 2. In Sly 2, they made 2 extra characters playable, Murray and Bentley, as you could see on the cover art. Murray is built like a tank. He's built as your brawler. He's made to be used in more action-oriented segments where he's beating up a bunch of bad guys, because he could take a lot more hits than Sly and Bentley can, and he's not as good at acrobating as Sly, but he's good at beating up the bad guys. There's nothing bad I have really to say about him other than when you have to use him to get to the mission marker, you have to basically learn how to navigate the field differently from Sly. You might be used to him. That's not really something to harm the game with. It's just a nitpick that you had to get used to. For Bentley, however, he was the most breakable of the trio. And before he got his super awesome wheelchair in 3, he was very, very meager. He was very underdeveloped in the second installation. He had a double jump, it didn't really go that high. He couldn't really fight anybody too well. You didn't really get too many good skills with him. Like, you'd get this awesome grapple cam in the 3rd game. He didn't have that in the 2nd one. He didn't really have too much to go off with him. So basically with him, you had to sneak by everybody and hope you didn't die when you're making your way to the next mission level. That's their gameplay then. That's how they work. Sly works a lot better. He retains all of his endgame acrobatic abilities that you unlocked in the 1st game, which is awesome. It should be understood that anything that he learned in the 1st game shouldn't be Metroided. You shouldn't have to, like, relearn how to swim like in Spyro. So, I have nothing wrong to say about his acrobatic and combat. It just gets improved on so many levels. He can take more hits now, which is also awesome. I had a bit nitpick on that 1st game. What I nitpick with this game, though, is that it decided to deviate a lot more into the different gameplay elements than Sly originally had. Sly 1 at least tried to keep the core gameplay focused on playing as Sly and going through the levels as Sly. Sly 2, the hub worlds and trying to collect all the clue boxes and everything, that still retained the whole Sly element, even if they probably even did it even better. But when you did the story mission segments and all that things, many of them started to deviate away from playing as Sly through a level and turned into more of a one-off minigame type of segment. For a few of them, though, to be fair, they did reuse gameplay elements. Like with Bentley, he had this helicopter. You could use that at least 3 or 4 times throughout the game, so that's not just a one-off thing. But for a couple of these, they were one-off mini-games that you did once, and then you never did it again, and I'm thinking these should have been optional, like I was talking about in the 1st game. A lot of these things should have been optional. They could have helped you with your final heist mission, sure, but they shouldn't have been needed. These gameplay minigame elements shouldn't have been required, since that wasn't the main gameplay element of playing Sly, Bernie, and Bentley. The missions where you just got to use them as they were meant to be used, there was nothing wrong that I could say about that. There was no rant that I had saved up about that. Then we hit the final boss. We hit Clockla. The first segment is this turret-type minigame, which I don't believe you used beforehand in this game. I think you used the turrets a couple times in the 1st game, but you didn't use it a lot in the 2nd game. So, it's a brand new, technically new, type of gameplay element introduced to players in the final boss, and if they couldn't figure it out, they couldn't get to the next segment where they do use Sly in the normal platforming way that he's supposed to be used. So this new type of gameplay segment is like the run breaker. It would end their run right there, and it did end my run there. I didn't try to throw my head against a brick wall until I broke it and moved past it. Maybe it's just something with the way my brain works, but I couldn't focus on too many different things at once. It's just the way my brain works. If I see rings, I focus on the rings, and then I get hit by the missiles. If I see missiles, I focus on the missiles, and I get hit by the rings. I couldn't focus on too many different types of things coming at me at the screen at once. It's just the way my brain works. Even in other games, like shooters, I focus on one shooter at a time. I focus on watching him and watching where they're going, and I'm not paying attention to the other guys, because if I paid attention to them, I would lose sight of the one I'm watching, and then I'd get hit by them, and it's just a mess. Maybe I'm just not meant to play these types of video games. I don't know. That's just more of a nitpick personally to me. Sly 2, overall, on so many levels, was way better than the first one, but I do personally like the first one, at least in terms of keeping it to the core of what Sly was, which is playing as Sly. Doing just Sly. Not to say that Murray was any problems. I loved using Murray. I hated using Bentley. I'm sorry. The second game made Bentley terrible. And you had to use him a lot. He had to use him a lot, and he just really didn't have too much to help him get what he needed to get done. You had to... I guess that was the point, maybe. He was made to be frail. Moving on to the third game, this is where I had the Rant files set up for. This is why I made the Rant files, because of the third game. The third game, to me, felt like a mess. They began work on the third game almost right away from the second game, and they didn't really have enough time to really grow a lot of things. They just kept the core gameplay the same, they kept the engine the same, Sly control the same, Murray control the same. Bentley, however, got a major upgrade that was needed. His chair is awesome. I love his chair. I have nothing bad to say about Bentley in the third game. They just did everything right for him. He got this triple jump, or was it quadruple jump, to help him navigate, because Sly could navigate with his acrobatics and platforming and climbing up stuff. Murray could navigate with this new ball he learned in this game, where you could jump super high depending upon how far you fell down from something. And that made it a lot easier to get around with those two. And I think that the developers learned that it was hard to get around with those two in Sly 2, the first time they were using them. I think they realized that they were very limited in how they and where they could go. So they decided for the third game they'd make it a lot easier to be mobile with them. So that was great. I have no problems with the playing as those three in the normal gameplay. My problem is that they decided that they wanted to expand so far and spread the characters so thin. Sly is playable for maybe 50% of the game. Maybe 50% of the game. Probably even less in terms of just playing as Sly with the normal acrobatics. They spread out the other gameplay mechanics into a series of mini-games, or playing as these other characters. They introduce other characters who are playable only during those missions. Some of them are good, some of them are not. The Carmelitas are just like a run-and-gun type shooting segments, and they're fine. They're really fun. The Guru segments, he has no method of combating people. He has to hide, and he jumps on people, and they charge, and you could attack with them, you could jump with them, and that's how you platform. You have to jump on a bad guy with the Guru and do stuff with them. The only problem I would say I have with the Guru is that when he jumps on these characters, they are in like this rage mode where they're running forward. You cannot stop with them. You cannot stop. It's just an on-rails run and gun until they crash into something. I think that makes it a bit... It's just a personal nitpick. He's fine. And then Penelope basically takes over for Bentley in regards to using any remote-controlled helicopters or cars. She's probably just there for the plot. She's probably just there for the plot, because there was nothing that she did that Bentley didn't already do in the second game. Outside of maybe that one Cutlass fight in Episode 5, Part 2. That was all Penelope. Bentley could do that, obviously. He could do it when he could walk. So that was the one thing that she got to do. That was entirely her own. What else here? Let's see, they have the Panda King, who is playable. You can only use him for like three levels, since he joins fairly late compared to everybody else. He joins at the end of Episode 4. You could use him one time in Episode 4. You could use him one time in Episode 5. And I think that was it. That was it. You could use him to take out these vampires or something, and then you use him for the first half of the Kraken fight in episode 5. His gameplay style is pretty OP. He's got this. He's not good at. He's not as mobile. He's not as mobile as anybody you could previously play as. He has a double jump. It's not that high. He's not that fast. He can't climb. He can't do anything like that. He doesn't have a ball. He doesn't have a booster shot with the Bentley's wheelchair. He doesn't have any of that. He's meant to stay on the ground. What helps him is that he has this type of karate chop that one-hit KOs even the big bosses, the big bad guys. It one-hit KOs them. It's very slow, though. You have to get up behind them, and you gotta make sure you hit them. Because if you don't hit them, they'll retaliate, and you'll get hit before you can hit them again. He also has this fireworks long-range type of weapon that you can hit up to 4 people at a time as you're charging up these fireworks to attack people. It was great. I have no complaints with the Panda King. The only complaints I would say that I have for the Panda King is that he's underutilized. He's added very late, and he's just arbitrarily used for a couple missions, and that's it. The part where the Rant comes in is that Sly, at least to me, maybe I'm playing as him wrong, I could never figure out the dodge mechanic, but in the episode 5, part 2, you're fighting this Kraken-type creature. The first half, you're playing as the Panda King, and really, he comes into his own here. His gameplay style with using the fireworks and using his chops and all that stuff is perfect. It's just chef kiss perfect. I wish the entire boss battle was fought with the Panda King. I really do, because he shines beautifully in that fight. Then the second half hits. The Panda King for some reason goes downstairs to make more fireworks or something arbitrarily, I don't know. But then you're forced to use Sly for this one segment that I could just never pass. No matter what I did, I couldn't do it. It falls back to the reason why I couldn't finish Sly 2 at the end. It's too much stuff was on the screen at once. It's this second half of the Kraken fight on episode 2 is set in 3 waves. In the first wave, he's just slapping the ship with his tentacles. You have to slap at the tentacles with your cane to pin them to the ship for some reason. You have to pin 3 tentacles to the ship to bring the Kraken close enough to hit him with your cannons, because he's out of range of the cannons currently. That's fine. The tentacles slap the ship, and they don't stay for very long, though. They stay for like half a second before the tentacle leaves the ship, and you have to wait for another one to strike the ship for you to strike at the tentacle to keep it pinned to the ship, however that makes sense. For a gameplay element, that means you have to watch the Kraken in the background. You have to watch him in the distance. He's got a bunch of tentacles waving in the air, but the animation for the tentacles changes when it's about to strike the ship, so you know where that tentacle is going to be when you want to strike it to pin it to the ship, so to speak. So you have to have some level of focus on those tentacles to be able to do what he's doing, because they don't stay long enough, so you have to be where it's going to strike the tentacle in time. I know I'm not doing a good job at describing this, but for anybody who has played these games, you should know what I'm talking about. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm sure there's plenty of videos out there for you to look up. The Kraken boss fight of episode 5, part 2. The second wave, however, you still have to slap the tentacles onto the ship. You still have to slap those, but you now have to slap 4 of them to pin them to the ship to bring the Kraken close. Sounds fine. Obviously, you'd have to do more for the next wave. It's more challenging. But they added a third thing that really messed me up. the Kraken starts spitting fireballs at you. It starts spitting fireballs at you, and I think they're like they seek you, so you can't just stay in one place. But what messed me up, it's that, I'm sure it was easy for a lot of other people, but my brain's just not wired the same way. I could not focus on those fireballs for the life of me. When I was focusing on the tentacles and the animation changes for the tentacles, I had to focus really hard on those. I had to watch those tentacles to be able to make sure I was where I needed to be to strike the tentacle to keep it pinned to the ship. And while I was doing that, I was getting hit left and right by the fireballs because I couldn't watch the fireballs. If I watched the fireballs, I couldn't watch the tentacles, and I would always miss the tentacles. And sometimes I'd be standing where the tentacle would strike me, and I would get hit by the tentacles. I couldn't. It was one or the other for me. I couldn't do both. My eyes just could not do both. And that was a run ender for me. The bulk of the game was fairly easy. I lost maybe once, then I figured it out, and then I beat that mission. But this one segment ended the run for me. It ended it. And I was gonna give up then and there until I looked up that I could just skip episode 5 and put in a code to start episode 6. And I thought, alright, I'll do that. I'll start episode 6. So I skipped episode 5, and I started episode 6, the final episode of Sly 3. And, this final episode, I would have to say, you have to use every single new member to the Sly Cooper gang that you spent the past 5 episodes collecting, which I thought was really cool. You had to play as the Carmelita first. You had to play as Carmelita first. She's not part of the gang, but she was playable, so I guess they made her arrive just in the nick of time to save Sly, because he gets caught in the prologue, which you played, which episode 6 starts up right away after the prologue, which means that episodes 1 through 5 are basically a big, long flashback. Cool story design. So you play as Carmelita, which was fine. And then you play as the Guru in the next segment, which you had to jump on some sharks to strike this island or whatever, which was fine. You had to play as Penelope, and you had to control your remote control car to strike at these other remote control cars to get an electrical charge or something to strike some anti-air defense towers or something. That was fine. Then you had to play as Sly in the helicopter airplane, whatever, which I believe in episode 2 you had to do more than once, so you at least you at least knew how to control the airplane. I don't have any problems with that segment. That was fine. The next segment, I think you controlled, I might be skipping ahead a bit. Before you used the airplane, you used Dimitri, who you picked up in the last episode, to go underwater. I forgot to tell you how Dimitri plays, because he's just that underutilized. I forgot to tell you that after you pick up the Panda King, you recruit Dimitri. And Dimitri is your underwater guy. He's the underwater gameplay segment. You can swim, you can do whatever, and then you could shoot a harpoon gun. It shoots very, very slow, though. It shoots very, very slow. It's very bare bones. He's very underutilized. You use him twice, and that's it. I felt that was arbitrary. I really thought that if you were gonna make Dimitri part of the team, you should have given him at least 3 or 4 segments. 3 or 4. Same with the Panda King. Both of them are very underutilized. But at least the Panda King is very fun to use. Dimitri, I just had to force myself to play as him. So you did a Dimitri segment, and then you had a boss fight with Dimitri. It was a bit difficult because I just didn't have that much time to use Dimitri. I used him in just one level previous, and then I got this level, so I just had to master his ability with very little time. And it was serviceable, though. It was serviceable. So then you move away from him to the helicopter thing, and then you move away from the helicopter thing into the Sly Cooper vault. This was the best part of episode 6 to me, the Sly Cooper vault, with this extremely challenging but very serviceable platforming gauntlet using Sly was the best part of the game to me, because this was the core gameplay element of the first Sly game. You used Sly to do your platforming, and that's what I thought that this third game lost sight of. It lost sight of Sly in favor of everybody else. It improved everybody else, but it kept Sly the exact same. But the vault was very fun. It was very fun. After that, you had to use Murray and Bentley in another final boss segment against the bad guy, Dr. M. And after that, you fight the boss again as Sly. It's fairly challenging, but you could figure it out. It's challenging, but you could figure it out. It's probably the best boss fight of the trilogy. Why? Well, let me explain. In the first game, the final boss was a series of mini-games using a jetpack until you finally got to do a platforming segment to bash Clockwork in the head. In the second game, you had another mini-game segment, which then ended into a paragliding segment, which then ended into a segment where you use Murray and Bentley to do a thing. And then you had Sly finish Clock off or whatever. And that just kind of felt far away from the course. The best boss fight in Sly 1 was the fight against the Panda King. The best fight in Sly 2 was the fight against Dimitri. The best fight in Sly 3 is the final boss. Why? Well, it's because you're using Sly. You're using Sly in the gameplay mechanics that you learned throughout the entire game. And that's the focus. That's the best part, is when you're using Sly the way he's meant to be used. You're not fighting a final boss using some arbitrary minigame segment into another minigame segment, into another minigame segment, into maybe finally using Sly the way he's supposed to be used. I hate the minigame segments. I think I'm not alone in that. I think a lot of people hated the Murray races in the first game. I think, it's just, they branched too far out and lost sight of what they had. I can't really knock the Kraken fight in Sly 3 because it's just my own personal thing. I couldn't do it because I couldn't focus on those things, but other people probably don't have the same limitations as I do in regards to focusing on things, so they probably could have done it in their sleep. That's fine. That's fine. But my gripe with Sly 3 is the branching out, trying to do too many things at once. It's like, how do I explain this? Imagine having a pool that's 100 feet deep. It's a very small pool, but it's very deep. You could swim very far down. That was Sly 1. Now imagine an Olympic-sized pool that's probably 50 feet deep. You could swim down, not as far down as the first one, but there's more to swim across. There's more to do. In Sly 3, imagine you have a lake that's 5 feet deep. It's a big lake. There's a lot there, but it's very shallow. And I think that warranted a rant files out of me. I think that you didn't need to make a lake, because you're limited with what you could do. You're limited in how much you could do. So when you try to introduce too much, you end up making everything that you introduced too shallow. I felt the Olympic-sized pool 50 feet deep was fine. You expanded a little bit, you had to reduce the depth, but you had that perfect balance. This has been 35 minutes of me ranting about these things and discussing the game. I doubt anybody listened to this. I think you could probably view this as something like a podcast, because I have no animation on my screen. I have no movement on my screen. All I have is my voice discussing something. So, if you're going to watch this, I implore you to just listen to it, not really watch it. It's 35, going on 36 minutes now, of me just talking about stuff. So if you want to just listen to me talk about something like a podcast and you driving somewhere, or you're just working on something else like on Photoshop or GIMP, or you're just chatting on some social media site or you're surfing the web, I implore you to just do that while you're listening to me. You don't have to look at this game on this screen for 36 minutes. It's not worth it. But maybe it's worth it to listen to what I have to say. And if you've made it 36 minutes into this video, if you've made it to the very end, I want to thank you. I want to thank you so very much. You are a trooper. You suffered through 36 minutes, going on 37 minutes of me just talking. Thank you. And remember, be imaginative.